pop-up events and retreats. And now here we are, 2020, in this era of the corporatization, or at least potential corporatization of psychedelics. You've heard of big pharma, big cannabis. Well, big psychedelic is knocking on the door now. And this is a panel, that comes really without judgment, or seeking to come from a place, free from judgment, and inquiring what are the promises and hopes of this wave of corporatization, and also what are the dangers and concerns. I mean, perhaps one of the key promise or hope is that many of us recognise that we are facing some very severe and intersecting crises, not least the climate and ecological crisis, perhaps above all, but then more acutely the coronavirus pandemic. And it seems that we may well be in need of powerful new tools to help shift people's sense of self, if you like, vis-a-vis the natural world and one another, and psychedelics clearly have the potential to be one such of those tools. Maybe corporatization is the best way of getting those tools out to as many people as possible in as short a space of time as possible, and that's possibly the kind of main point of that people think, well, yeah, maybe this is a good thing. On the other side, we might say that in the 60s and 70s they were very optimistic that things were going to turn out, just right there, and it didn't all go to plan. So at the very least, it seems wise to be aware to the shadow side and the potential dangers of mixing psychedelics and capitalism. And then maybe the final, so the promises, the dangers, and then really what can we do about it? What do we want to do about it as a community, and not underestimating the power and the potential influence of this very community medicine festival here, and the various organisations represented. This community could be a very important voice in the debate. So we get a chance to start crafting that voice together here today. So just a little bit more on me. I trained as a scientist. I studied physics and complexity sciences. I got really involved in the world of climate activism, then worked for an economics think tank called the New Economics Foundation. I mentioned founding the Psychedelic Society in 2014. In 2016, I co-founded the Psychedelic Experience Retreats program, which was really the first kind of modern psilocybin-assisted retreats program of the last years, which has now been followed by several other similar programs. And this year, the Psychedelic Society, or the company behind the Psychedelic Society, transitioned to becoming a not-for-profit worker cooperative called Dandelion Collective, and the Experience Retreats side of things has separated to become an independent entity registered in the Netherlands to continue that work in a slightly different direction called Ashleigh, which is actually a great segue to introducing the first, maybe I'll say a little bit about you all and then I'll invite you back to speak. But yeah, on my left here we have Ciara Sherlock, who until very recently has been my colleague at the Psychedelic Society, working on psychedelic experience retreats, now become Ashleigh, and she's a psychedelic facilitator and space holder, and will be kind of an important voice kind of from the inside, if you like, someone who is working for an organisation that is, as I understand, very much thinking about these questions and what the ethics of taking large amounts of money, but what happens if we don't, and things like this. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you, Ciara. We also have Ros Watts, who for a long time was working at the Psychedelic Research Group at Imperial College London, and relatively recently has moved to working with Synthesis to, as I understand, help bring access to psilocybin therapies to some of the people that might otherwise not have been able to access the programs as they have so far been constructed through Ashleigh or through Synthesis. So welcome, Ros. And finally we have Alexander Beiner, who, can I describe as a journalist? Something like that? Yeah, sure, a journalist, short, in short. who's one of the co-founders of Rebel Wisdom, wildly successful YouTube platform with close to 200,000 subscribers, I think now. They've actually done quite a lot of work on psychedelics, and timing would have it that Ali's just finished, or just about finished, a film on this very topic, the corporatisation of psychedelics. So you can all look forward to kind of going home and watching that over the coming days. Okay, so I'm going to give you each 5 minutes just to give us some initial thoughts on this topic, if you like, and just how it relates to you and maybe your organisation right now. No, I forgot something very important. These bits of paper that I'm holding here, because this will give you a little bit more context and something more to respond to. So there was an article in Business Insider just like a month ago, which featured like the 9 top psychedelic companies that have raised loads of money or something. That wasn't quite the title, but that was the vibe. So just to give you an idea about what is actually going on out there. So a company called Field Trip Ventures initially raised $9.7 million based in Toronto. They started out as a venture fund, and but since they've started opening a series of clinics in North America, and have also funded a mushroom cultivation facility in Jamaica. They're hoping to open 50 to 60 clinics across Canada and the United States by 2023 that will be offering psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. They're currently just offering ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, as that's all that's legal in the United States right now, but I'm sure there's a vote actually in Oregon in November that might legalise psilocybin there, and I know they've been interested in that. We've got Lucius, who have raised $13.5 million, London, New York based, the project of a chap named Shlomi Raz, I believe. They're interested in developing treatments, or interested in the potential of psychedelics to treat chronic inflammation with potential benefit for sufferers of Alzheimer's. There's MindMed, who have raised $30 million, who've actually already gone public on a Toronto Stock Exchange and now have a public valuation of $100 million. Their main thing is investigating ibogaine for opioid addiction, and they apparently have invented a new molecule, 18-MC, which removes the hallucinogenic properties of ibogaine, but still maintains the opioid kind of relieving, healing effects. You have Compass Pathways, who've raised $58 million, London-based. Apparently they're valued at over $100 million now already. They're focused on psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. Their parent company, Atai, has raised $100 million as a valuation of over $240 million. Based in Germany, they describe themselves as an investment platform, and Count Peter Thiel's one of their investors, who is the founder of PayPal, and I believe gave quite a lot of money to the Trump campaign. So it's a real mixed bag of investors in this space. So this press release is being released on a more or less weekly basis on this topic. So there was one just last week from Field Trip saying, what's this? Field Trip Psychedelics Inc. announced its closing of an $11 million financing entry into amalgamation agreement with Newton Energy Corporation. It's written in very formal language. I'll quote this. The executive chairman of Field Trip Psychedelics said, "Our ability to secure this private placement validates the strength of our business strategy, brand, and the incredible team of physicians, psychologists, therapists, scientists, and employees at Field Trip. It's also reflective of the rapidly increasing interest in the investment community in the science of psychedelic compounds and their incredible potential across a number of applications. Securing these funds strengthens our balance sheet and provides us with capital to execute against these growth plans." And this is the kind of language which we're reading and encountering in the psychedelic space now, just to give you a taste. So that was announced. Yeah, they've raised a further $11 million, and they've started researching what they call FT104, a next generation psychedelic molecule. Presumably the FT is for Field Trip, so we're starting to name molecules after our own companies now, which I thought was interesting. They don't do much detail on what this next generation effect might be. They've also just released an app, which actually, it kind of looks interesting actually. Like it's supposed to guide your psychedelic trip, and I think it includes kind of music, some of the music technology that I think you're referring to. why have a therapist when you go nap? Yeah, well, that's good. We'll get on to discussing that, I'm sure. Yeah, and the final press release that I've got here is from Synthesis, actually, your company was, which was just released just a few days ago. Where are we? Synthesis raises $2.75 million to develop end-to-end professional platform for psychedelic wellness and therapy. And let's see. So maybe I'll just read how Synthesis. What should I go for? I'll go for the quote from the Synthesis CEO. So Synthesis CEO Rachel Aiden said, "In our journey thus far, Synthesis has developed a strong reputation in the ecosystem for delivering psilocybin experiences with the highest regard for safety, professionalism and integrity around the depths of transformations available through psychedelics. Building on our successes in experience delivery, Synthesis is enthusiastic about this new capital and our new investment partners to help us expand our offerings. With a stronger emphasis on clinical treatments and education, we will appeal to practitioners seeking psychedelic-centric training whilst maintaining the high standards of ethics and transpersonal understanding of these experiences we have come to stand for." Sounds pretty good, actually. Certainly relative to the first one, doesn't it? Yeah. Oh, excuse me. Okay, there you go. I hope that wasn't. But I thought that was important just to give you a little bit of background of what is actually going on in the space right now. And the context is, like companies are raising millions, tens of millions of dollars to start like rolling out treatments and build clinics and so on. So, with that in mind, I'm going to invite Ciara to speak for up to 5 minutes, perhaps, and just on your feelings of what's going on in the space right now. The promises and the dangers.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I feeling really interested in this conversation. Have no idea what's going to come out of my mouth. I feel like there's so much to say, but yeah, how to really encapsulate it all. But I suppose I'll just start by saying, as Steve said, I'm one of the co-founders of Ashleigh, which is an evolution of the experience retreats that we're a part of the Psychedelic Society. We've been holding psilocybin ceremonies, group psilocybin ceremonies, for more than 4.5 years now. We were one of the first organisation to really start to do that in a very small and quite quiet way. We have worked with hundreds and hundreds of people so far, and we've learned a lot along the way. We've also seen a lot happen around us along the way as we've been doing this work. Synthesis was born, a lot of other psilocybin retreats were born, and to witness organisations pop up all around the place has been very, very interesting. I think it's also worth mentioning work that I've started to do as a board member of the Guild of Guides recently in the Netherlands with, for example, some team members of Synthesis, with team members of other leads of the psilocybin retreat. So basically it's a collective, a bringing together of people that are doing this work, which is very much unregulated, very much on the borders of legal and illegal, because the psilocybin is legal there to use, but at the same time, it's not regulated. There's no higher body of people keeping an eye on what's happening, how it's ethically being run. So we've been doing some work on putting together what it might look like. What kind of ethics do we want to adhere to? What are the codes of conduct that we, as a group of people who don't actually work together but work separate, doing similar things, what do we really want to adhere to? And through that work, as well as the work with Ashleigh, like really seeing what happens when huge amounts of money are given to people to do work like this. And as I said, from our perspective, like we haven't taken investment so far. We've done things very slowly, and that's how I feel. Personally, I feel like things should be done. We're working with nature. We're working with elements of nature, with mushrooms, with psilocybin. Nature moves in a slow way. Nature gains wisdom over long periods of time and doesn't just boom, 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 and you know, it's considered, and that feels really like an important element to keep in mind in how we work with these medicines and how we move through and navigate this way. So yeah, seeing some organisations get large amounts of money, which is amazing and can be really useful. And again, it is also about getting the medicine to people that really need it and creating access to people that really need it. But what I would love to keep in mind in this conversation is the big amounts of money that come into organisations and the pace at which organisations need to move to give treatments to people, and the ethics behind that, the pace at which we feel like we know what we're doing because we have a medical doctorate or we've done a couple of years in training in using these medicines, when really there's always learning to be done, and we really, when we work with these medicines, we don't really know the answers. We're working very deeply with the mystery, and I think that as you were saying a little bit earlier on with like the scientific side of things, it can be very much stern in their protocols, and that you have to know exactly what's going to happen, and that is just such a joke in the way of using psychedelics. It's working with the mystery, that's what this work is about. And yeah, there's just a lot of questions about integrity and how integrity can be maintained within the pace at which large-scale investments need organisations and want organisations to move in order to get money back in return. So yeah, there's a lot there. And I think a huge question that maybe we'll talk more about as well is accessibility. You know, it's amazing to hear and to just think about organisations that want this medicine to be accessible to people. But yeah, is it really making it accessible to everybody? And maybe we'll go into this later on about how we can actually make it accessible and empowering for people to use these medicines themselves, rather than large-scale, very financially abundant organisations saying that they want to make it accessible, but actually in the end only making it accessible to certain types of people. So yeah, more on that.
Thank you very much, Ciara. Ross.
I mean, there's so much I want to say that I almost can say nothing, because it just completely breaks my heart. You know, it's so sad what in many ways what we can feel happening, because it feels in a way like it's a kind of foregone conclusion. I try not to be hopeless about it, but I do feel very sad about it. And when you were reading out, Stephen, that list of different companies, many of them I've had contact with, and I don't really know what it is that makes me feel hopeless. I think what it is that I think what you're talking about when you're talking about the kind of corrupting factors that come in with these huge pots of money that come in, and it's not just money that corrupts, but it's also something, the power of psychedelics, that can corrupt. There's a huge power in that mystery. And a huge power that we give to those that work within it. There's this sense that you're somehow a magician in some way. There's a massive, so we both work as guides, as therapists that give psychedelics to people and sit in a room with them, and there's a huge projection, I'm sure you feel this too, on us. It's like, oh, you've healing angels, there's this massive, it's not just the money coming in that corrupts, it's also the power of these incredible tools that we don't understand, and our desperation for magic, and idealization of those that can offer us magic. And I think in the face of that, what's really, really important is the deep values and integrity of the people working with these tools. And when you went through that list of different companies, I'm just reflecting back on interactions I've had, and that's what makes me want to just weep on the floor, because you mentioned Peter Thiel, and it's even awkward knowing how much I can say about these things, because there's such a kind of sense of these hugely powerful organisations, and in the past I've been very limited in what I'm allowed to say, because of my affiliation with Imperial College up to this day, and I'm actually no longer working with Imperial, and I'm working with Synthesis. You read a quote from Rachel, our amazing CEO. And it would seem to many that a move from an academic institution such as Imperial to a private company such as Synthesis is a kind of move towards the money, towards the problem that makes me so sad. But in fact, at Imperial, we were using psilocybin that was made by Compass Pathways, and we had to give our data to Compass Pathways. And we had to sign some very strange contracts which demanded we would not publish our data without showing it to them, that they would be able to publish data that without us. They could withhold certain things. I mean, it's the same kind of corruption you see in Big Pharma as standard, but we all have this kind of slightly naive hope, but when it's psychedelics, it won't be like that. So with Compass, who were synthesizing our psilocybin, and all of our data was going to them, to further their case for having a kind of monopoly, obviously, which is what Peter Thiel, if people know about him, he writes books about getting a monopoly, and he started PayPal. He's also somebody who reportedly is invested in a company looking into technology for blood transfusions from young people to older people. That's another of his companies, and supports the Trump administration with a lot of funding. They're owned by Atai Life Sciences. Christian Angermeyer, who is one of the founders of that, is best friends with Robert Kagame, who is a Rwandan dictator, currently being investigated for all sorts of different, potentially fraudulent activities involving huge amounts of money. So my move away from that and using that psilocybin, which for me, every time I gave a participant those capsules, I felt compromised at the deepest level. And now that I'm working for Synthesis, which is a private company, however, the people in that company I hold in high esteem because of their values. And that's what it comes down to. It's so nuanced, it's so complicated, because it's not about whether it's a private company or it's a this or it's a university. It's about the individuals running the ship and the metal. When the corruption comes in, when the lure of money and power comes in, will you say yes or will you say no? And I've watched people falling like dominoes, people that I've respected for a long time, falling like dominoes, saying yes when the chips are down and the money and the power is there. They just take it. It's a human quality. So, and it's a human weakness, and I'm not saying I'm better than that or that we shouldn't be human beings, we are, but it's just we're not supporting each other in a way, we're not aware of this in a way that we need to come together and with a kind of peer pressure situation, name this and say, we all, a bit like the Guild of Guides are doing, we all need to stand together and resist this lure, because these companies, they rely on scientists, they rely on the data to legitimize them. So if we can work out who are the people that are coming from a place of integrity and coming, like Rachel, who you read the quote from Synthesis, is someone who I admire so deeply in her ethics and her integrity. I've seen it over and over and over again. And I know the direction she wants to take that company in is one that will further it for the whole ecosystem, not just certain people. And so it's us working out like who to stand with and stand for and who to resist and say no to, but we just don't know that at the moment. We just think that private companies are bad and universities are good, and my experience is that it's very different. And it's probably the end of my 5 minutes, and I'm just going to very quickly shout out somebody called Bennett Zellner, who, if anyone's really interested in this, it's so worth looking him up. He's an economics professor, and he's looking into a model for disseminating facilitating access to psilocybin called the pollinator model, and he uses this metaphor of pollination, the idea that a community wellness relies on the amount that resources are recirculated within that community. And so rather than companies where the psilocybin work that goes on all gets sent to a few shareholders who are going to make huge sums of money, they're kind of co-ops that are run by the local community for the local community, and the resources and that. So seeing psilocybin as pollen, and the model that he's using is working with a different company called Usona, who makes psilocybin, synthetic psilocybin, but they are not for profit, and they're coming from a completely different ethical framework. and they are working on this pollinator model where their not-for-profit psilocybin will be like pollen that goes into a community, brings revitalization, growth for the people working with it, the people experiencing it, and that, for me, gives me the most hope as an alternative to the doom and gloom and heartbreak I feel in the corporatisation otherwise.
Thank you, guys. Alexander Beiner.
Yes, hi. So yeah, thank you both. I think a lot of the stuff I wanted to say as a preamble, you said really eloquently, so it saves a lot of time. So yeah, I'm working on a film right now about the corporatization of psychedelics, and been speaking to a lot of the people that, actually some of the people you mentioned, Usona, Bennett Zellner, etc. And yeah, just before going into that a little bit, I think this microphone's a little bit giving some feedback. Yeah, that's better. Yeah, I think the overall theme. No, this one's even worse. There we go. That's good. There we go. So I think for me, the overall theme that I feel, at least, is the sacredness of psychedelics and what it means to have something sacred. In the ancient world, it was very common to have a relationship with the sacred where it doesn't just look after us, but we look after it. And that's something we've really lost, the idea of looking after the sacred and taking care and giving attention to something that is, for me, and I think for many of us, a sacred medicine. And so that pain that Roz was talking about, of what Stephen was reading out, that huge amounts of money, huge amounts of profit motive coming in, yeah, for me, and I think for many others, it's very, very painful, because what is lost is a sense of sacredness. And the corners that are cut are not just corners in patient experience, for example, people not getting enough integration, being therapists who aren't trained properly or haven't had many psychedelic experiences of their own, holding space for people and not knowing what comes up. I should also mention I work at Synthesis as a facilitator as well. I forgot to mention that. But yeah, so there's all of those problems, but there's also the sense of, is it likely that all of these VC funds and pharma companies coming into the space see psychedelics as sacred? Probably not, in my opinion. And I don't know if you saw our faces when Stephen was reading those, but I think Stephen, you mentioned in the beginning that we're going to try to be non-judgmental, and I have tried really hard, but I think I've lost all my zen in this process. So I do have strong judgments about the way it's happening. I think probably most useful is to talk about the movement that's now happening within the community towards ethics. So here you mentioned that happening here in Europe. There's also an organization in the US called the North Star Pledge. And I've spoken to them a lot, I've interviewed them for this film, and I also went to their town hall meeting, which was on Zoom, obviously, in COVID. And the session I went to, the breakout I went to, was called How to Give It Teeth. So what they've done at the North Star Project is they've spent a lot of time in really having roundtables with different people in the psychedelic community, so with clinicians, with shamans, with activists, and then they've, from that, created this ethics pledge, which is effectively a pledge that they're hoping people will sign in order to stick to this ethical behavior, a bit like a fair trade stamp. So that's all very lovely, but my concern with that is how do you possibly enforce it? And in fact, another concern is you could actually make it worse by creating a situation where these large pharma companies and anyone else start effectively doing what corporations have done with the environmental movement. It's just greenwashing. So this session that I was in, called How to Give It Teeth, was very interesting because people didn't really have a solid answer of how would you make it enforceable? How would you actually hold let's say a large pharma company to giving ethical treatment to patients and to behaving ethically as a company? And that, I think, is a main question right now in the community. And as we look at the corporatization of psychedelics, the huge question is, how do you make it enforceable? Because if you can't make it enforceable, you might as well not have it. And in fact, you might as well, like, you could well make it worse by giving people tools to say, yeah, we're doing this, we've done this on the pledge, we've done this on the pledge, we've done this on the pledge, we've got our little badge, and now we're going to be shady as hell, and no one's going to, really going to have any recourse. So what I'm curious about, and again, a shout out to Bennett Zellner, who Rosa mentioned, who's an economist and has a really great model called the pollinator model, which I won't go into because A, I don't know it well enough, and B, it's a little bit more complex, but there are models out there for figuring out how to do a much more grassroots, community-based version of psychedelic medicine, and for these clinics popping up. But what I would be quite interested to see in the community, and the conversation I'd like to see, is to bring some game theory into it, and to go start from the point that we are all corruptible, and then work out from there. The concern I have with the North Star Pledge is that they are hopelessly naive in their hope that a pharma company is going to just adhere to this. So I'm just curious to see how honest we can be. I want to do a thought experiment that, imagine that you are on a newly set up ethics board, like a charity that's responsible for the ethics of the psychedelic space, and you're looking at clinics, private clinics, you're looking at the medicalization, so you're looking at things happening in universities and institutions and hospitals, and you are one of, say 10 people who's going to give the rubber stamp for a particular pharma company to get the gold star ethics pledge that they're ethical, like their kind of fair trade thing. And one of the people from that company approaches you privately and offers you £500,000 to just put in a good word, to just maybe nudge it in just a slight way. No, of course we know that we would never expect you to kind of, go too far, but just to put a good word in, £500,000, right? So raise your hand if you would struggle with whether to take that money. And I would suggest that if you haven't raised your hand, you're either a lot wealthier than I am, or you are almost godlike in your integrity, in which case congratulations, or you're embarrassed to raise your hand. I don't know. So, but that's I think the point we need to start from, and from that point, then we can start looking at it like a game. Okay, let's assume that we're corruptible. So how do we create a system of checks and balances that make it very, very difficult to be corruptible, or for the corruption to take root? And that's a structural process. And one thing I think we could do right away is that anyone working in a university or in a medical establishment who is working with, say, a company like Compass or another one, that they make their finances transparent, straight up. Have they been offered shares in those companies? Can they show that they haven't? Have they been promised shares after a certain point? That is the minimum requirement, I would say, and that's the kind of way we should be going, a structural solution rather than the hopeful, we'll make an ethics pledge and people will stick to it because everyone's as lovely as we are. So that's kind of what I'm concerned with right now, and I think I'll stop there. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, maybe let's just continue on that theme of corruptibility, and it actually linked to me with something, Ros, you said, which is, you said something like, I have such confidence in the individuals running the ship, the synthesis, and I don't doubt that you absolutely do, and that they're absolutely fine individuals, but one of the points about corruptibility is that unless the system is beyond the individuals, unless the system itself is not corruptible, then someday you get an individual coming in as the CEO of synthesis who is that little bit less nice and turns things in another direction. So, just wondering if you have a response to that.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, I think our only, the power of the collective is our only hope here. And the power in, as Ali was mentioning, the idea of having some kind of structures to hold people accountable, that if in that scenario, say our CEO left and somebody else came in, what we have an organisation where the power of the collective, the collective shared hope, the collective shared vision is powerful enough that wouldn't be allowed to continue. I have faith in that anyway. I hope that would be the case. But I think that what we need is we need to know what we're aiming for. So I think where these situations get blurry is where we don't really know what our point of evolutionary development is. Like, what I heard about it in like evolutionary psychology once. There's this idea of like a unit of evolutionary development. Like, what's the end point? So if you think about things and how things evolve, like for example, like Amazon, the company, hugely successful, roaringly successful. They would have had at the beginning like an endpoint, an evolutionary endpoint is a very successful business, exactly where they wanted to be, and they got there. But people that come together in these kind of organisations, we're often not business people. We don't have that clear goal of like where we want to be in 5 years' time. We come in because we like humans and we like uncertainty. And we like, people that are interested in psychology and psychedelics often like uncertainty, they like humans, and they like mystery. So we don't have a 5-year plan about where we want to go. And in that vacuum, in that space of uncertainty, that liminal space, that things can get swept, people can sweep in and kind of take that space, and suddenly the ship gets turned in a different direction by people who are really good at driving ships and know exactly where they want to go, and everyone else is like, I'm not sure if this is what we've planned, but that's okay, you know. And often people want to work with psychedelics so badly, so desperately. Therapists that have been working with CBT for a long time, and they know that it's not very effective for most people. When they see this coming in, they so want to work with these tools that they're kind of willing to make a lot of sacrifices in terms of the person driving the ship kind of going to that country, not that country, but I'm on the ship. I get to do this thing, so I will acknowledge it. And so it's these little tiny incremental, little mini sacrifices. That's not quite right. And I've been in that situation myself, on a ship that was going in a direction that I did not want to go in. But I was doing the work, and I was lucky, I was on the ship. So I think it's about the collective of people saying that when there's someone hijacking that, you all turn the steering wheel, but you've got to know where we're going. And so that's why we need a model like Bennett Zellner's model, which says, okay, in 5 years' time, if we don't want psychedelics to look like Big Pharma, what do we want it to look like? And then focus and organise and get some business people and strategists and on the case with us to try and steer the ship in that direction instead.
Ciara, is that inspiring anything in you?
Yeah, it's a predicament really, isn't it? It's like, as organisations like Ashleigh, like Synthesis, who are very different in many ways and have kind of taken different paths, as you say, Roz, about you know, when there's someone driving the ship and then we don't know too much about business plans and all that kind of thing, and someone comes in with money and say, okay, yeah, well, let's go in that direction, and yeah, just to speak from personal experience, that's really been a place where we have been, to say like, yes, we want to scale, we want to touch more lives, we want to work with more people, but what power do we give away when we take money from someone else, when we are accountable to someone else for making sales and things like this, like, and that's what I'm curious about with Synthesis. It's like, what power must you give away when you take in like financial power from others? And that's kind of like where my concern lies quite a bit.
So I'll just play devil's advocate for a minute. A question to you, Ali, which is like, and if you haven't noticed, we're in, you know, some really significant intersecting crises right now. Like, it would be great if we could take the time to, like, you know, develop really, you know, gentle, slow, non-profit, cooperative things, but we're in an urgent situation. So, like, if the money's there, we need to take the money, we need to roll out these medicines to as many people as, you know, so that as many people can possibly get them in a short space of time as possible. So, do you have any sympathy for that line of argument?
No. The reason is because I think there's an assumption in the psychedelic community, and particularly in a lot of people who might have, let's say like a VC guy who's gone to the Amazon and had a few ayahuasca ceremonies and had a big opening, comes back and now wants to invest in it. Like, there is an assumption that psychedelics are in and of themselves agents of change, when they're not. they're, like as Stan Grof famously said, they're non-specific amplifiers. They amplify what is there. And John Vervaeke, who's a cognitive scientist we've had on Rebel Wisdom quite a few times, he points out that he talks about psychotechnologies. So psychotechnologies are technologies of the mind that help us as human beings change things, like literacy is one, for example, or meditation. And psychedelics, he argues, aren't a psychotechnology. It's what you do around the psychedelic that's a psychotechnology. It's and of course they have their own effect. But if that weren't the case, then everyone who trips at a festival would reach enlightenment or heal all their trauma, which is not the case either. So giving psychedelics to as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, could just as well be an awful idea as it could be a good idea. Giving psychedelics to the right people in the right way, yes. And as many people as possible in that way, yes. But another issue, I think, a major issue, is that it's a bit like Rosa was saying about the direction we're going in. As a culture, deep in a meaning crisis, where all our systems are collapsing and the old way of doing things is no longer sustainable, we don't have a direction to go in. We don't have a foundational myth. We don't have any of that. And you need that usually for a psychedelic experience. Like Betty Eisner, who's a lesser-known psychedelic researcher, who was really instrumental in setting and dose, famous 3 things you need to think about in a psychedelic experience. She also talked about matrix. So matrix is the entire web of connections that you're part of, your culture, your life, the life you're going back to. I know Roz would have a lot to say about that in terms of how it works therapeutically and how important it is to have that network. And that's also something Bennett Zellner talks about. We don't have that as a society. Like, what as a society are we for right now? Like, what is our point, you know? We're here at Medicine where we're talking about indigenous culture, and in many indigenous cultures the point is to steward the land, to be a steward species. We don't have that. We don't have a big meta-narrative like Christianity, really. We have consumerism. Yep. But that's our thing right now, and it's obviously not going to cut the mustard. And so that's why we have people taking psychedelics and then, Instagramming their ceremonies. That's you interpret the psychedelic experience based on your stage of development and your own cultural perception. So, yeah, so giving it in the right way is really, really important, I think, we'd be able to say.
And in that way, there are clearly some parallels between what happened in the 60s and 70s, with people like Leary just being like, just everyone to take acid, and then the world's going to change, And like, we've already found once in a way that scale alone is naive and not enough, perhaps. But so to strike a more optimistic tone, and then there is a very interesting movement out there in the cooperative business world for platform cooperatives for consumer/worker-owned versions of some of the big technology companies that you might be familiar with, like what would it be like to have an Uber that was owned by the drivers, or like an Airbnb this actually exists. It's called Fairbnb, like an Airbnb platform that was kind of owned jointly by the people who are offering properties but also choosing to rent them. And so what is the potential for a kind of like cooperatively owned psychedelic enterprise? And what is the real role of ownership of these businesses? That isn't something that we've focused on to do specifically yet, because my understanding is with synthesis, like that ownership is actually rather concentrated, and some small amount of shares has now been sold off to raise almost £3 million. I'm very grateful to my friend and colleague Richard Dennis Bartlett of Inspiral on this. He says, like, it's all well and good to talk about working in a non-hierarchical organisation, and it might you might have really friendly business meetings, but for as long as there is actually someone who like owns that company, in principle can just say you're fired, then like there will continue to be fundamental power dynamics, which often in in current Western culture go with patriarchy and white supremacy and so on. Basically, all of the people who running the companies like Red Owl are white Western males, for what it's worth. So yeah, where does ownership fit into this? And do you have any sense of the potential for the development of new organisations, cooperative forms of organisation, maybe involving people that might be sitting here right now?
Well, Bennett Zellner's model is focusing on this at the moment. So there is this idea of the pollinator clinic, and in the pollinator clinic, these would be locally owned, locally run centres, setting up in communities, obviously in countries where it's legal, and each community there would be some kind of board of local people that understand what the needs of that community are, and crucially what the trauma footprint of that community is, and what is needed. And this ties in with ideas from community psychology, which is all about, rather than just giving everybody everywhere access to a 50-minute session in a room with a psychologist and an individual, with the psychologist saying, you are ill, let me give you this treatment, and the other person saying, okay, thank you. The community psychology idea is that it's developing interventions based around what different communities need. So there's one community psychology program called Music and Change, so this is a massive diversion, but it's an incredibly successful enterprise where they realised there was a huge problem with young men in Camden in violent gangs with huge levels of violence between them and very little hope for change. And a community psychologist who I trained with, her task was to find a solution to this problem. And traditionally, psychology provides things like CBT therapy, and that wasn't good, going up to one of those young men and saying, would you like to have a year's worth of CBT with me to talk about your gang violence, would be completely missing the point. So what she did is she spent about a year hanging out on the estate where most of them lived, sitting on a bench outside the fish and chip shop until she finally made friends with somebody who made friends with someone else, and after a long period of time worked out that actually what lots of these young men loved was rap music. They then worked with a rap musician who they knew that was popular at that time, and they started a music project for these young men to, instead of, for a diversion, and so the crime rates went down massively, mental health improved. So community solutions to problems, I think, are extremely powerful. And so if we apply that model to psychedelic work, then you would get a community working out quite slowly, organically, as nature moves, what is needed here, what is needed to bring balance to our community, and setting up by the people, for the people, working out the resources in the area, like there's some therapists, there's some nurses, there's some social workers, bringing people in for psychedelic therapy, done in groups and individually, and then crucially having local stakeholders from the community there to help people, once they've had this, so psychedelic experiences bring this kind of openness to connection to other people in your environment. So if people come for psychedelic therapy, they're suffering from depression, there might be lots of social factors why they're also feeling stuck, like they don't like their work or they're not connected to other people. So you bring stakeholders from the community in, which say, oh, well, I've got a company, we're doing a tree planting project, or I've got a company, we're looking for people to go and do some other project. Then people in this open state make links with people in their local community. So the idea is that you use psychedelics to bring in this kind of, you bring some kind of thriving into the whole system. So that's obviously like an amazing model, but what Bennett-Zellner is coming up against is, as you say, ownership. How does this work? We don't have the legal structures, the governance structures, we don't have the financial structures, any of these structures, because you need startup capital. And as soon as you have startup capital from a few people, the whole thing gets skewed. So the challenge is finding out ways of getting those stakeholders, supporting those stakeholders to set up these projects, finance them, give them the governance structures, but we need to completely rewrite the law, we need to rewrite all these things in order to do it. So we're just at that moment where the old way is obsolete, we need a new way, we can't see it yet.
Yeah. So what that conjures in me is, the debate around legal regulation, decriminalisation, things like this. This is a potential source of hope at this point still, because most of these big companies are banking on the fact that at some point in the near future these substances are going to be legalised, legally regulated, and in such a form that they can use them and profit from. Currently that isn't the case. Field Trip are building clinics right now, like basically just betting that it's going to happen. And actually different choices are being made, and maybe perhaps the psychedelic community needs to think quite carefully about what exactly we're shooting for here, and seeing that actually there are some pitfalls, which is simply saying legalise everything or that, and that in Oregon at this point, I believe, following the actions of a group called Decriminalize Nature, it's now the growing and I think gifting of psychedelic, of actually all entheogenic plants and mushrooms has been decriminalised. And in lots of ways, I think that would actually be a pretty good place to stop, because that would actually, if we could all simply grow our own medicine and pass it, and gift it to other people in our community, then we would just never even get to the point of allowing these big corporates to get a look in. Where are you each at with this question of legal regulation versus decriminalisation, and what the intersection is on what we were talking about today? Ciara,
Yeah, I'll try and come up with a coherent point. Because there really is two different things that we're talking about here. It's the medical model to treat people with severe mental health illness with psychedelics, which is one side of it. And then there's the, what about everyone else? Everyone else can use psychedelics too, or should have access to an ability to use psychedelics in a way that enhances their spiritual growth, their personal development, their own personal trauma healing that may be seen as different to severe mental health issue, but is still as significant and as relevant to work on. So there's those two things which can kind of get really mixed up in this conversation, I think, because when we talk about all the big money coming in, the corporatisation, the scientific studies and things like that, they are for people that have severe mental health illness, and there's such a place for that. There's such a deep importance for that to be studied, to be held. My worry about is the expense of what that is right now, but again, hopefully somewhere down the line it will be more accessible and more affordable for people. But we're just in early stages of that. But then there's the other side of it, which is kind of what we with Ashleigh work with, more of not people with severe mental health illnesses, but people that are looking for personal healing and may feel lost in life, not knowing what they want to do. Maybe they're really young and they're just kind of stepping into the world and wanting to find their place. Maybe they're in their 60s and 70s and they're retired and they want to, develop themselves further, explore themselves further. There's no real one type of person that comes on these retreats and wants to do this type of work. And for me, I see the work that we do actually as almost like an education program. It's not this commodity of come, have a psychedelic experience, let us blow your mind and then go home. But it's more of, and what we're developing into is creating authentic rites of passages for people, because actually I feel like our lack of rites of passage, our lack of marking significant moments in life actually does lead to a lot of mental health illnesses and confusion in life and sense of soullessness and being lost. So creating these important points in people's lives for them to reflect, for them to look forward is really, really essential. And what I see our work is doing is just educating people and empowering people to be able to do that themselves, to have the experience with us, but then to also bring that ritual, that sense of sacredness, that mindfulness into their life for their entire lives, and not just for this one peak experience. But what I also feel really, really called to, and something that you touched on strongly about, is not only wanting to empower people to be able to hold themselves with and have their own psychedelic experiences and not need to go and pay 10,000 euros to a therapist or something like that, because that's not really what they need. Actually, they just need to learn how to do it themselves. They need to feel empowered in themselves, and they shouldn't have to buy from a dealer, for example, something that they don't know where the medicines come from, how it's been grown. They shouldn't really need to buy from a chemist either. They should be able to grow it themselves. People should learn how to connect and grow their own medicines. Like that's for me, that feels like the ultimate empowerment of forget about these big companies, forget about chemists, forget about looking up to someone else for the answers. Learn how to do it yourself. Grow medicines. You maybe give them to other people, but have that kind of spiritual connection and understanding of what it means to actually grow and actually connect with, especially something that you use as a spiritual tool. Yes, food is also like a whole other thing I feel is really important and that we should all be doing and connecting with, but especially things that we use as spiritual tools and practice is something that I feel like shouldn't be left out of the conversation.
Thank you so much. Ali, you want to go?
Yeah, no, I think that was brilliantly said, firstly, yeah. And I think that distinction between the medical side and the side of people who want to take psychedelics for self-exploration or just personal healing is really key. And I kind of wish I'd framed what I was saying with that, because I'm thinking mainly medical when I'm talking about the corporatization. But on the other side, yeah, I think it goes straight back into like how do we develop a culture that is, and that's actually already there. We have a psychedelic culture already from like, so after research was stopped in the 70s, early 70s, all the way up until 2010-ish, there was more stuff happening. There was the kind of, I call it the lost years. It's like psychedelics lost weekend. And during that time, the psychedelic counterculture and underground was still really thriving, and that was kind of where I cut my teeth, as a teenager, and kind of still until now, I guess. That's where I feel like, to an extent, there's my tribe. And enormous amount of work was done on people figuring out, muddling through, and then also figuring out, okay, here's a safe way to take psychedelics. Here's you can go on Heroin and have an entire massive database of people's trip reports, etc. Now, I wouldn't encourage people just willy-nilly go out and take psychedelics. There's a lot of preparation, but there is a level of personal responsibility as well. I think it's a fundamental right to do what you want to do with your body. And the thing is, the question is who regulates it. So then something like an ethics pledge starts to make sense. There's something called the Guild of Guides as well, which is going on there. You guys are working on something as well. That feels very different because that is you can't really control everything that happens in a ceremony. And I think Ciara said early on, psychedelics don't lend themselves very well to planning. You can't go into a trip and be like, right, I want to have this, and then I want to fix my relationship with my father, and then I want to look at a tree, and then I'm going to do it's not how they work, and it's not how they're going to enter the culture either, because they have a way of not doing what you want them to do. So I think a kind of ethics for private ceremonies and for people going to ceremony in, say, South America, etc., that is really, really important. And that is a cultural thing, and that requires having a strong culture, and that accountability comes from community. It comes from someone going, oh, I wouldn't go to their ceremony because they're really sketchy, I heard this, this, and this. And then some way of making that public and going, without it being a witch hunt, which is another problem that can happen, but that has to happen, I think. And I think it's essential that it does, because psychedelics, for all of my negativity around the medicalization, I think we do need psychedelics. They're profound and amazing and elicit a kind of change if used in the right way that I don't know anything else can.
Okay, any burning comments for that? Otherwise, since the audience. Yeah? Okay, so we've got 10 minutes left, and I'd love to have some of your comments and questions. So let's go for this first. Yeah, I'll repeat your question back, but say it as loud as you can.
Sure. So what does the panel think about the development of and legalization of cannabis, and then the development of CBD? Because that's a pretty clear analogue of taking something that was deeply criminal, misunderstood, and a collaboration between communities and cooperatives and big businesses and big funding to essentially take something which was counterculture and criminal, make it legal, and create an environment where you have like a wellness drug in the form of CBD that I think 14% of American adults now take, as well as cannabis being accessible and legal. So that, to me, looks like the direction, the path that psychedelics could go. So
great question. I won't repeat all of it, but basically it's saying more or less what can we learn from what's happened with cannabis, which of course is kind of like 5-10 years on from where psychedelics might be right now. Maybe Roz, is that something that you know much about or have learned from?
Well, I think one big difference is that, apart from a very, very small number of people, cannabis isn't used as a therapeutic, in a guided session. It's not used in that kind of context. So what we can learn is that it's, it's kind of private use or recreational use, and sometimes therapeutic use, but done by the individual. So in a way, as an analog, it's perhaps not. It doesn't quite provide the same kind of roadmap. But I guess my main kind of interface with it is of the many, many people who have made an awful lot of money in cannabis that are now approaching us. I get probably 10 emails a week from cannabis multi-millionaires who are going into psychedelics because they've made a lot of money in cannabis. And my frustration that they would see it as the same thing, because it's like that field trip quote, you said something about like the balance sheet. Like it's clear that for them, I think the motivation is clearly a financial one. They love cannabis and they're coming into the psilocybin field purely for financial motives.
I've actually heard a phrase, the mush rush, is being used to describe, particularly for cannabis investors, like the rush into now investing in mushrooms as like, the next way of making money. Do you have any thoughts yourself on like, what we should be learning from the experience with cannabis?
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned that Timothy Leary took an academic approach and essentially shut down psychedelics for 20 years, 30 years. It seems like cooperation between big business and communities is the only way to get the laws changed, so that it's actually
cooperation between big business and communities is the only way to get the laws changed. And personally, I have some sympathy for this. I don't mean to like totally shut out the role of business and entrepreneurs and marketers in terms of actually changing attitudes around some of these substances and ensuring people do have broader access to them. So thank you very much for that contribution.
I can just add a quick thing. It's like, for example, in Canada, they've made like millions and millions of dollars off the cannabis industry on through tax, and then they've used that to do positive things within the community, which is amazing. But again, it's like the point that I was saying before. Do you have to put your money into big corporations in order to gain access to it, or I think that should be an option, but then to have the option as well of doing the very simple task of growing your own plants and using your own medicine. It's like, that it's important to have both of those options rather than only having the one.
Thank you. Great question. I was actually wondering the same. So the question was, does Bennett Zellner's pollinator model of like community-based and owned psychedelic clinics, does that include medicalization of psychedelics? Will people potentially with more severe mental health difficulties also be able to be treated in these clinics? I guess Ross, you might know something with that.
Yes, that's the idea, because Bennett's working with a company called Usona. Usona are making synthetic psilocybin and doing lots of research studies with people with depression and various other conditions to see if psilocybin is an effective treatment. So yes, it would be very much linked in with that. There would also be research centres, so they would be contributing data. So what we'll see is psilocybin will be licensed as a medical treatment condition by condition. So at the moment, Usona and Compass are both accruing data on treatment-resistant depression and major depression. And once we have enough data, that will then be licensed, so psilocybin licensed for that condition. So what I think the model will be is that, for example, if psilocybin is licensed to treat depression, then these pollinator clinics will use Usona psilocybin, not-for-profit psilocybin, as a treatment for depression. And then they will also have some way of doing research studies at the same time on the other conditions, so people can come with all sorts of different things, and they will then accrue that data so that other conditions can then be licensed too. So you have a situation where more and more people have access to it.
Thank you. You said it's not for profit.
This is exactly the problem. So that's the $1 million
Well,
question.
but actually, MAPS just finished raising $30 million, which I think is being match funded by another $30 million. It might be 15 and 15. So actually, there is a huge amount of philanthropy going on, and like the kind of classic critique of kind of not-for-profit pharmaceutical development is just that it's just far too expensive. You can't. There's simply not enough money you can raise from donors to put a drug to market. And actually, MAPS are doing a pretty damn good job in showing that that you can. That they are basically at the final stages of turning MDMA into a medicine, almost entirely through donations. MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies in the United States. So shout out to Asena and MAPS and the organisations that are trying to do things in like not-for-profit or like B Corp way. It's it's not all kind of like big cannabis money on the corporate heads in space.
The level of philanthropy is incredible, and I think it's because of the particular moment we find ourselves in, where there is the mental health crisis is so huge and affects for people with huge amounts of money, seeing the uncertainty of our species in a way. People are becoming a philanthropist that might never have been, because they're realising that in a way there's no point holding on to their fortunes if we're all going to die.
You can do with Jeff Bezos realising that. I think the richest man in the world has £200 billion worth of wealth. But Mudge, would you like to ask our final question? Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to know if anyone's got any thoughts or if anything's happening about basically most of these psychedelic medicines came from a plant which came from indigenous culture. Are any of these indigenous cultures getting any money? And if, for example, how much psilocybin money has gone to Mexico?
Yeah.
And what about ayahuasca, which is by being more effective, more powerful antidepressant, going to the Amazon?
Great question. Not least is my understanding that many indigenous communities in the Amazon in particular are being very hard hit by the coronavirus at this time. I mean, we think we're having it bad by having to sort of wear a mask when we're raving, but so what are indigenous communities getting back from the development of these plants and medicines into treatments?
Yeah, I mean, that is something, that the North Star Pledge is looking at. Answering nothing right now, I think, is probably it. But I would also say that psilocybin is not owned by the Mazatec. We have our own psilocybin growing probably very close to here somewhere. But certainly with ayahuasca or peyote, like that is a real question that needs to be asked. And how that actually, and done in the right way as well, because it's just like dumping money at someone like, hey, cheers for your medicine. That would also be kind of quite a problem. But yeah, I think it's a very good point.
So that's actually all we have time for. But I'll just finish with a quote from Rick Doblin, who's the founder of MAPS, who spoke at the end of a recent psychedelics conference that gathered sort of big investors in the space. And apparently he ended with, the larger mission, which is really getting rid of the drug war, mainstreaming psychedelics, making it so that people don't have to get it from us, from medicine or religion, they can get it on their own from a licensed legalization system, which may well include actually growing it ourselves, I guess. So, thank you very much for your attention, and you're very welcome to stay connected with the Psychedelic Society, psychedelicsociety.org.uk. We will continue to be producing events and content on these topics. Thank you.
And I would also like to actually just let everyone know that if you would like to find the work that I do, Alalaho is spelled Alalaho. It's a very beautiful meaning, so you can look it up when you find it.
And in that case, further shout out to synthesisretreats.com, I think it is the website, is that right? And Rebel Wisdom, rebelwisdom.co.uk. I'm sure we will all be producing more good content on these issues. Thank you very much.